Thank you, everyone, for joining us once again on Near and Rupar, the weekly live stream hosted by myself, David Near, publisher of The Down Ballot, and Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice. We would be delighted to take any of your questions this week and every week. You just need to be a paid subscriber to either one of our publications. Both would be even better. And there is just such an onslaught of news to discuss. It's almost hard to know where to begin. And Aaron and I were prepping for the show, talking about what we wanted to focus on, the direction we might want to take. And that kept changing over the course of the week. But I think we have no choice but to start with the absolutely brazen and totally illegal attacks on Jimmy Kimmel by the federal government to try to get ABC to force him off the air, which they in fact did. It's a grim and dark week, but I will say there are some small signs to be optimistic because we did just see polling come out from YouGov showing that majorities of Americans are very much opposed to what the Trump administration and what ABC have done here.
Yeah, I think that is an important contextual point to bring up that this does not seem to be super popular. And anecdotally, I mean, I'll just share that, my mom, who is in her 70s, really enjoys watching late night TV and has actually going back decades now. I remember when I was a kid, my dad watching Letterman, and, then he turned into a Leno guy for a bit there. And then, he watched Kimmel in more recent years. And, he passed a couple years, but my mom still watches late nights to this day. And, I was talking with her and she was like, I don't really know what I'm going to do now that, Colbert is on his way out and Kimmel is off the air. And, it's kind of I think she mentioned like, I might have to watch Seth Meyers now. It's just kind of like her third choice. But, it is maybe more salient in some ways to the boomer generation. I myself don't watch a lot of late night TV, but I think, I've had a couple of people in my life kind of ask me whether this is a big deal and if so, why? And, I think it's a big deal because we are seeing that Trump is having major successes in chilling not only free speech, but specifically criticism of him on, major broadcast airwaves that are watched by millions of people a night. And I think this is also an example of how Trump 2.0 in a lot of ways is a lot more effective than 1.0 in that, with some of the attacks on the media we've seen, they've really identified that, a lot of these big companies need to be approved for mergers that they want to do, which is that issue here in the Kimmel situation, with I believe it's called Nexstar and Sinclair, and a potential merger there that needs government sign off. And so, Brendan Carr, who I don't think was really a household name before this week, but the FCC chair, in this case, really identified that they can leverage these mergers to basically extract concessions from parties that have business before the government. So in this case, getting a merger approved. And so, we all remember back in Trump's first term, him kind of railing against late night TV and criticizing people like Kimmel. And, there were kind of spats that existed on the level of social media and rhetoric, but didn't really have consequences in terms of like how society functions. But I think we're seeing now that it's a savvier operation with some smart operatives who kind of know, how they can punish critics of Trump. And I think this is a very clear example of that. So, there was some talk I was seeing today. I mean, I guess, I don't know how much stock you can put into this, that ABC execs are kind of talking about the potential of Kimmel returning. But, if I was Jimmy Kimmel, I don't think that'd be a super appealing option since that even commentary that I think was entirely appropriate in this case, where for people who don't know, or maybe you haven't been following the story, it stems back to Monday when Jimmy Kimmel in one of his monologues was talking about the Charlie Kirk assassination and basically said something to the effect of Trumpers have been spending all weekend trying to make it seem like this guy wasn't one of theirs. So sort of suggesting that the shooter was a Republican or a Trump supporter. Now, it should be kind of mentioned that while we know that the shooter's family was kind of a typical Utah conservative, gun-loving family, there isn't any evidence that I've seen that the shooter was a Trump supporter, but, I still think the kind of broader sentiment that the shooter came from a culture that is a very kind of Trump-friendly culture is a totally valid one, but this has been twisted by people on the right into Kimmel basically blaming the shooting on Trump or, smearing Trump supporters or something like this. And so I actually wasn't even aware that this was a big controversy until the news broke that Kimmel was being pulled, which I think occurred on Wednesday. So a day and a half after his comments aired. Then when I went back and kind of read up on it, it was clear that on Tuesday there were some people, kind of attacking Kimmel over this, including Brendan Carr, who went on Benny Johnson's show and brought up the possibility of Nexstar affiliates dropping Kimmel's show, which they did just hours later. You basically said something along the lines of, these stations kind of do it the easy way or the hard way. And I guess the easy way would be what ended up happening just hours later when these stations announced they wouldn't be carrying Kimmel. And then ABC nationally announced that they'd be following suit and indefinitely pulling him from the airwaves.
The thing about this is Trump had already expressed his desire for Kimmel to be fired before Charlie Kirk's death. So this is something, a bug up Trump's ass that's been there for a long time. But also, like, let's step back for a second, Aaron. How fucking insane is it that the president of the United States is issuing demands that certain media figures he doesn't like should lose their jobs? I mean, that's
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely wild. And, the so much of the mainstream media just isn't reacting in the way that you would hope, that you would want,
Yeah.
to stand in defense of democracy and to say, whoa, this is not just some, Trump pushes the norms kind of, story where they, massage it and try to normalize it.
Hmm.
Things are getting really grim here. And Trump even said, to your mom's point about Seth Meyers, Trump put out a tweet saying that he wants Jimmy freaking Fallon. I mean, so
Yeah.
anodyne, that guy, and Seth Meyers to also be fired.
Yeah.
So, the MAGA is, it's an insatiable movement. There is no
Mm.
point at which they will ever say, yep, we've done enough, we're happy, we're good. They will always find more enemies to target.
Yeah. Because it strives on conflict and it strives on having enemies. And again, in this case, Kimmel's comments were entirely defensible. Like, you could maybe
Of
throw
course.
in that he should have caveated them a little bit more or something like that. But the way that you see some of these Republicans, and I think the worst offender that I saw personally was Representative Randy Fine from Florida, who was on CNN yesterday. And credit to Dana Bash, who did a pretty confrontational interview with him, calling him out as he repeatedly mischaracterized what Kimmel had said to make it sound 10 times worse than it actually was. And this is not, I got a lot of, when I posted some clips from that interview, there are a lot of people who were kind of commenting like, boy, Randy Fine has no reading comprehension, or did he even watch what Kimmel said? And it's like, it's not that these people are ignorant. I think
No.
that it's the shameless lying, that is the thing here. And so, you can't shame the shameless, I guess. But, the point simply being that, if Kimmel, in this case, again, he didn't really say anything that was offensive. And so they'll just make up something, to kind of make him the villain of the story. And then in this case, I think this is kind of score one for actually like reading Trump's tweets and paying attention to them, because as you mentioned back in July, after CBS announced that Colbert would not be having his contract removed, Trump, which I posted this at the time, he posted on True Social, and then I, shared it on other platforms where he basically said, Kimmel was next, and then Fallon, and so forth. And so, he was very transparent about his desire to basically purge all of his critics from late night TV. And, I can sort of understand it because, I touched on this earlier, but the first term, you had the spectacle of Trump, railing against people like Kimmel on social media, back then on Twitter, now mainly on True Social. But, it got to be such background noise for people that they just kind of eventually, including reporters, kind of tuned it out. It's just
Yeah.
Trump being Trump, kind of screaming on social media. But now, you see when he has the right operatives in place, guys like Russ Vought, or in this case, Brendan Carr, that they can actually make these things happen for him now in a way that I think he was kind of impotent to pull off during his first term. So, I guess to kind of bring the conversation full circle, I don't know if you're typical American at home who is habituated to turning on a little bit of late night TV after they watch the news or something like that. You know, I don't really see this being like something that they're going to approve of in any way, shape, or form. That will this kind of tank Trump's standing? No, but I think it's a sign of kind of the authoritarian overreaches that we're seeing across society, and I think potentially you'd have more of a leg to stand on if had Kimmel really gone hog wild and said something wildly offensive. even then, obviously, it would be unconstitutional for the FCC to be, leveraging local stations to pull critics of Trump off the air. But in this case, the entire thing was manufactured from the jump. And so, that's really, I thought former President Obama made a really good point along these lines where on Twitter, he weighed in on this and basically said something to the effect of, rights don't mean anything if people just surrender them in advance without a fight. And these major media conglomerates are especially vulnerable to that because they have business before the government, where the government, Trump specifically, can punish them, if they don't kind of toe the line. But still, I mean, you would love to see, an entity like ABC put up a little bit more of a fight. And you can contrast that just this week with Trump's lawsuit against the New York Times. He demanded 15 billion. And, we wrote this up. Liz Dye did a great piece on Wednesday in the newsletter about this, how it was like, even in the context of Trump's ridiculous lawsuits, this was like one of the most ridiculous. And just today, I was shocked at the speed of this. A judge tossed it out, basically saying it's completely frivolous. Now, the New York Times, which is essentially an independent outlet in the sense that it's owned by a specific family, they have fewer pain points that the government can leverage compared to an ABC or the local affiliates, Sinclair and Nexstar. So it's a little bit of a different situation, but there's been a number of instances that we could talk about where fighting has actually paid off. And so in this case, not only to not fight, but then to kind of surrender in advance. You would just hope that the fourth estate, so to speak, would hold itself to a higher standard than that.
So we have a question from Deborah who asks, do you think Democrats in Congress will ever do anything more than write strongly worded letters? And I totally understand that sentiment because it's so often so frustrating to watch congressional Democrats, Republicans put up this resolution in the House to honor Charlie Kirk, and 95 House Democrats voted in favor of it. But at the same time, I thought that Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut had a pretty good response. I think it was yesterday to what's going on. And he said to Brendan Carr and essentially folks in similarly situated, hang on to all your papers, because as soon as we're back in charge, you're going to get subpoenaed and we're going to get to the bottom of all of this. And God, we have seen so often that when Democrats come in and clean up the messes left behind by previous Republican administrations, there is such an urge to want to move on and look forward and not look back. And we saw this with Obama and George Bush, and we saw this with Biden and Trump. And it's going to be a real question if and when Democrats ever do take back power, whether that attitude is still going to prevail, because I think attitudes like that die hard. But it is good to see Chris Murphy saying, you know what? There are going to be consequences for this shit. There are going to be repercussions. Yeah. And Democrats have to start talking that way. And when you start talking that way, that might actually induce MAGA world to perhaps pull its punches a little bit. Now, many of the true believers don't think that they will ever lose power. Or they don't think that Democrats will ever follow through on these kinds of threats. But the more you make these kinds of threats, maybe the more likely they are to believe. And, someone like Stephen Miller is never going to be cowed, but there are thousands of these other operatives who maybe don't look forward to the prospect of $1 million legal bill to defend themselves on who knows what kind of charges the next time Democrats control Congress. So, yeah, I would like to see more Democrats echo exactly what Chris Murphy said.
Yeah. And I saw Eric Swalwell said something very similar that got a lot of pickup in a hearing this week. And I do think you're right, because when you talk about it in that sense of, put us back into power and we will investigate and hold people accountable, like not only are you kind of calling out the problem, but it's also kind of providing people with carrots to go and vote for you. And so you're kind of projecting that you're not powerless. And, that is my frustration as someone who's like immersed in cable all the time, where, there's a lot of Democrats who go on cable or do interviews like on C-SPAN that can kind of be safely tuned out because like they're good talking points, but we've heard them.
Right.
They kind of need to be combined with some sort of, action and again, like, I don't want to kind of come off as someone here who has unrealistic expectations of Democrats who obviously are in the minority in both chambers, but Democrats will at some point in the future be in power again. And I do think that that's one way that you can kind of, seem like you have some agency here, is to say, in 14 months when we have the gavels again, we're going to investigate, we're going to hold people accountable. because this stuff isn't popular. Again, I mean, I saw numbers just before he went live where Trump's disapproval is up in the 60s now, his approval's in 30s. I mean, this was one poll, but I saw circulating on Blue Sky. So this stuff isn't really playing well, I don't think. And with the Charlie Kirk thing, it kind of depends on the specific Dems that we're talking about. Someone like Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona. When he's gone on TV to talk about this, I mean, he always kind of leads with Charlie was one of my constituents. Like obviously it's a horrible tragedy what happened to him, and so if you're from a Democrat from Arizona, or places where Kirk was active, I sort of get that you want to at least be sensitive to the humanity of the situation. But I did see AOC had a clip that was blowing up, calling out just things that Kirk said, about the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and explaining why she couldn't vote to, kind of lionize him. And so, that was another thing that I thought was very noticeable this week is how just talking about things that Kirk said on camera, posted on social media is like a bridge too far for Republicans now, that's somehow like a personal attack just to quote him.
Yeah.
But in any event, I did, on this topic, I wanted to address something that Steven dropped in the chat. And I don't want to get ahead of my skis here, but he said, "Why did Tyler hate Charlie so much?" Which I do think, it's an important question as we sort of, try to unpack who's to blame here. Obviously, Republicans are trying to portray Tyler Robinson as some sort of like radical leftist. There's zero evidence of that.
Yeah.
The only data point that's kind of been out there, and I haven't seen a ton of confirmation about this, but that there was a report that Tyler's romantic interest, is a man who's transitioning, becoming a woman, or is at least thinking about that. And the reason that I bring that up is because I saw Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene kind of running wild with this data point this week that he was Antifa, he was part of the transgender ideology or something like that. And it's notable to me how any sort of queer identity now has become like so partisan, where you couldn't possibly be a conservative if if you're dating someone who's trans or thinking about being trans, or if you're bisexual. So that's the only, when you see Republicans kind of running with these wild claims about Robinson being Antifa or being a radical leftist, I mean, the only data point is that it seems like he was bisexual. And I think that kind of speaks volumes that's where we're at, where, it's not like, Robinson had some social media or internet presence where he was, supporting Kamala Harris or trashing on Trump or Charlie Kirk. He did mention, and I think this mainly came from Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah, who in some media appearances referenced the fact that Robinson had criticized Kirk to other members of his family. I think he described him at one point, again, this is through Spencer Cox, but as a hater. And I think people are just kind of connecting the dots there that must have had something to do with his romantic interests. But again, the details on that are kind of scant because Robinson didn't have an internet footprint that we could really use as sort of evidence of what his political ideology is.
And it's so important to emphasize, like you were saying with Jimmy Kimmel, they're just going to make stuff up. I mean, Republicans did not wait for Charlie Kirk's body to hit the ground before they started blaming them. And them means us and probably everyone tuning into this live stream right now, and anyone who's ever voted for a Democrat or expressed any kind of liberal point of view on anything, anyone that they view as any sort of enemy was responsible for Charlie Kirk's killing. And the facts absolutely don't matter to them. And of course, as we have seen over and over across the last couple of weeks, anytime that they are confronted with any data or evidence or stories about right-wing violence, such as the assassination of Melissa Hortman, the state representative in Minnesota, Republicans are so ready to dismiss that, as a one-off, a lone wolf, a troubled soul. And of course, they are entirely prepared and eager to do the exact opposite with Charlie Kirk's killing. And so,
it's actually, I want to interject there, because I think it's even worse than that, because it's not even that they kind of downplay the Hortman assassination. They just blatantly lie about that too. Where I saw Donald Trump Jr. interviews this week running with this claim of, but he was a Tim Walz supporter. Like he was a Tim Walz, and which I've seen this. I think even Trump has brought up that talking point at one point or another. And of course, like the whole backstory there was Walz, the shooter's name is escaping me in that instance, was put on some kind of nothing nonpartisan board, like overseeing energy in the state or something like this. But but there's no evidence that they ever met. And so, a gesture, like a token gesture of bipartisanship gets spun into, this claim that the guy was a wall supporter. And, and this came up on CNN, an interview that Caitlin Collins did this week. It was with Ted Cruz, where Cruz was doing this, playing this game too. Collins brought up the Horton situation as kind of a counterpoint to the idea that political violence is a left-wing problem. And Cruz brought up, well, he was on a board that
Right.
Tim Walz put him on. And the guy literally had a hit list with like 40 names that were all Democrats on it.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
motivated by, by being an abortion zealot, basically. And so, again, I guess, just to return to that point, I guess it's not necessarily a novel one, but I think it's an important one. It's not ignorance, it's just shameless lying. And
Yeah.
in that particular instance on CNN, Collins did not call Cruz out on that. The interview ended with them kind of shouting over each other. But, that's the kind of facts you have to come equipped with to push back. Even then, I'm sure Cruz would have had some other further lie to continue to kind of, smear Democrats as being the purveyors of political violence. And we all know that Donald Trump has done more than anybody in the country over the last decade to lead us to this dark place that we're at.
So I want to return to something that you referenced briefly, Aaron, which was the Trump lawsuit against the New York Times. And the reason why is, Trump 2.0, as you were saying, he absolutely has people in place now that he didn't have the first time around in government who are willing to do his bidding in most capacities, but they are still a bunch of bumblers without a real plan. And I was reading the judge's ruling in this case, and I got to tell you, as a former attorney, what happened here was really quite unusual. The judge dismissed Trump's complaint completely on his own before the New York Times even, I think, had a chance to file opposing papers. The legal term is sua sponte. The judge did it on his own and wrote this scathing order saying that this complaint that Trump filed is such absolute garbage that it violates the federal rules of civil procedure, that it's full of just nonsense. It starts with talking about how Trump won the last election in a landslide, blah, 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 and this is all irrelevant. And the judge really raked them over the coals. I think he even said that the complaint was tedious. And so, the, these are, Trump now has lawyers willing to, in the private sector, willing to do his bidding on just about anything. You might recall during his first term, he often struggled to find lawyers, especially during his impeachment. No one wanted to represent him. That doesn't seem to be a problem anymore. But these lawyers also have to write their briefs in such a way as to please Donald Trump. And that pisses off judges. And so, yeah, that was a really good sign. And I do think you're right that the Times is probably going to stand up for itself much better than ABC or CBS did. But, judges still keep getting pissed at Donald Trump because a lot of the people who are working for him are still doing bumbling shit or bumblers themselves.
Yeah, that lawsuit really kind of baffled me because, again, like the shakedown schemes that he's had success with CBS or with ABC, the end game kind of was more clear in those instances, but like the Times is not going to let its credibility be demolished for no reason. I mean, they have no reason to give Trump tens of millions of dollars. He's asking for 15 billion, which is obviously completely ridiculous,
Right,
but even to settle for less. So, that was one where most of these lawsuits, when they're filed, you can kind of see what Trump is trying to accomplish, or at least what his leverage is. But, for reasons that you mentioned, I mean, the lawsuit in the Times case was completely incoherent on its face because it begins by, puffing up Trump as like this world historical winner. And he's had so much success on TV.
Right.
But then it's, accusing the Times of tarnishing his reputation because they endorsed Kamala Harris in a ridiculous endorsement and, things that are just clearly not, any way tantamount to misconduct or, doing damage to Trump's reputation, maliciously or using, lying about him or, misstating facts, things like that. So that one to me was really weird. And the fact that I think it was filed like on Tuesday and then already on Friday it's being dismissed, doesn't seem like a great news cycle for him. I'm not sure if he just wanted sort of the headline of like, Trump sues New York Times for 15 billion, and then he's just kind of counting on people not reading the follow-up coverage. But for those of us who track this week, I mean, you would know better than myself since I don't have a background as a lawyer, but that seems like an extremely quick turnaround from a
Oh,
lawsuit being
yeah.
filed to it being dismissed. And given how quickly that all went down, doesn't seem like it have much of a chance that Trump tried to appeal it or anything like that. So that was one where, I think sometimes, the notion that Trump is a strategic genius can be overrated, but I do think with his attacks on the media, there's usually kind of a strategic component to them. And this was one that just seemed like kind of venting or like, just a waste of time for basically everybody involved.
The judge did give Trump leave to file a new complaint. We'll see if they do. They probably will. But, in terms of the lack of strategic thinking, Trump has this weird approach, which makes sense for an autocrat, but is still weird, where he thinks that just about everything he doesn't like or that he feels aggrieved by has a legal remedy. And on day one of law school, what they teach you the difference between harms that have a legal remedy and harms that don't have a legal remedy. And the stupid example that they give you is, if I go to court and I file a lawsuit that I saw Aaron Rupar on the street and he didn't say hi to me when I greeted him on the street, and I was offended by that. Well, you might have been really offended, but there's no legal remedy for that. You can't actually sue someone for that. And Trump doesn't refuses to grasp that. He thinks that if
Yeah.
he's been harmed in any way, shape, or form, that there is a legal remedy for that. And the sick thing is that in many of the cases, including the ones we've been talking about, these absurd defamation suits against these major media networks, Trump has gotten legal satisfaction for claims for which there is no legal remedy because these companies feel a need to bow down before him. And that's absolutely, totally demented. But that's where we are. But sometimes, as with the New York Times, it winds up totally blowing up in his face. Aaron, I wanted to ask though, is it time that we switch gears to the topic we had originally intended to be the focus of this week's
Sure.
episode?
Yeah,
So,
the peek behind the curtain. Yeah, when David and I were talking earlier this week, we were going to focus this kind of around the shutdown, which could happen next week, and sort of game planning it. But then, as often happens in the Trump era, news intervened with the Kimmel stuff, so we decided to kind of restructure things. But yeah, to get to what we originally intended to talk about.
because in a way, it all ties together in terms of what kind of power do Republicans actually wield on Capitol Hill, and what kind of response will Democrats give? Will they, just right as the questioner was asking earlier, is it going to be another sternly worded letter kind of vibe, or are they really going to stand up for America? Something funny happened though. Someone messaged me, Aaron. The title of this episode was Trump's assault on free speech plus the looming shutdown. But when the notification went out on the Substack app, it got truncated to Trump's ass.
Oh well, evergreen.
So I hope that inspired a lot of people. I hope it didn't turn off people like, God, that's gross.
Oh, maybe yeah. I guess it could go either way there. Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of going either way, it really does remain to be seen how firmly Democrats will stand fast. And
Mhm.
we are once again in the same situation we were earlier this spring, where folks outside of DC were demanding that Democrats stand up to Trump and the Republicans and not just go along with more devastating budget cuts. And so we're back in the exact same situation again, where if Democrats don't provide votes for the GOP and the GOP refuses to eliminate the filibuster, then there could be a shutdown. And there are so many ways of looking at this. And on the one hand, I want to put aside politics completely and say, how can you collaborate with this regime? How can you actually give them anything that they want? How can you do anything except stand in their way? And a lot of Democrats on Capitol Hill have, I think, a lot of fear about the repercussions of a shutdown. They want to think about it from the political lens. But man, I think it's really important to remember that there hasn't been a shutdown, at least in a very long time, that has had a permanent negative political effect against the party accused of fomenting it. And the one I think about the most is the lengthy shutdown in the fall of 2013, which was completely caused by Republicans. Everyone knew it. All the media coverage, all the polls said that. And then Republicans won in a wave election in 2014. They gained more seats in the House. They flipped the Senate. By a year later, absolutely no one cared. And I think Democrats need to remember that. And on top of that, polling shows that most Americans would blame Republicans and Trump because I think they understand who has a majority right now.
Yeah, and so I'm assuming most of the audience understands this, but the leverage point is in the Senate. The House today passed the clean CR, so to speak. But I think the one thing that wasn't clean was there was some additional funding for security for members, kind of in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, which doesn't seem to be a huge sticking point for Dems. But now, of course, in the Senate, you need 60 votes. I saw just before we went live that Murkowski said that she is a no. So that kind of changes the math a little bit in terms of how many Democrats in terms of getting that 60 vote threshold. But the one thing I did like is that the Senate Dems seem to be making kind of maximalist demands. There was some talk in exchange for their votes. There was some talk a week or two ago that the demand would just be the enhanced ACA subsidies for a year or two, which drew a lot of criticism because it would have been another example of Dems kind of protecting Republicans from the consequences of their own votes, where obviously the big beautiful bill has a lot of cuts that are going to hurt people, but if you then take out some of the most punitive ones, it's kind of another example of people maybe thinking when they go to vote, if you're lower information, like none of this really matters, it's all just kind of like DC rhetoric, and it's not going to affect me. So there's kind of the competing demands of, do you want to help people in the short term, 1 or 2 years, versus driving Republicans out of power on a longer term basis, which will probably have longer term goods, a good impact. So instead of just asking for the ACA subsidies, I mean, it seems like the demand now is to basically roll back all of the Medicaid cuts, which is uh, probably something Republicans are not going to be willing to do, because that was basically how they paid for the beautiful bill, the huge tax cuts for the wealthy. But at least so it's they're making a big demand of Republicans, and then when Republicans inevitably say that they're not going to go along with it, the conversation then, hopefully, in the media, in society more broadly, will be about healthcare, the healthcare cuts, how they will hurt people, which is terrain that Democrats always want to fight on, because healthcare is one of the best issues that Democrats have. So in that respect, the strategy to me all kind of makes sense. It seems like it kind of sets up what the sort of the framework of the shutdown will be when it happens next week. And then I guess the question from there is, do Dems kind of stick with that even as the government shuts down and there are harms that affect some of their own constituencies, some of their own interest groups? What is it kind of, because I don't think Republicans are going to cave. I would love to be surprised by that, but it just seems to be, are Democrats going to go all the way to the mat, shut down the government for an extended period of time, or will they eventually cave? Or is there some sort of, if Republicans come to the table and say, we will extend the ACA subsidies for 2 years, which I think is the ask that Murkowski is making, if that ends up being kind of the offer, would that be enough, to get them to vote to reopen the government?
I have a question for you, Aaron. Do you think there's any chance Republicans would nuke the filibuster, or at least for this vote?
I really don't know. It's a great question. I think there's probably still some concern on their side about what that would mean next time they're out of power. And, I do think I'm persuaded by arguments that would be ultimately the best for American democracy for the filibuster to go, because, I think if you were making a list of the things that hurts the Biden administration, I think the filibuster would be right up there in terms of blocking a lot of his key initiatives and sort of creating the perception that, his administration was kind of impotent. Because, I do think that's been more of a problem for Dems, given the nature of the Democratic coalition, than it has been for Republicans, where, for Republicans, if they nominate a ton of right-wing judges and have tax cuts, like that's kind of enough, and do some immigration stuff. Whereas Democrats, I mean, the promises they make usually have more of a legislative component. And then when they're unable to deliver because of the filibuster, I think voters get frustrated with that and kind of feel like they're sold a bill of goods, that, it's all just kind of campaign rhetoric and it doesn't really result in changes to their lives and to society. So, I do think in that respect, just getting rid of the filibuster would be worthwhile. But, I still think you probably have Republicans like Ted Cruz who, maybe looking at the long game a little bit more, and, might see that be more beneficial long-term to Democrats than it would be for Republicans, because again, they're accomplishing a lot of their priorities even with the filibuster. So yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I still think if I had to if you're asking me to kind of prognosticate, I think a scenario kind of like the one I outlined where the government shuts down for a while and then eventually there's some sort of compromise in the middle. But, once you get to that point, because I think Democrats are going to be playing a fairly strong hand in terms of the issues that are going to be part of the public conversation are ones that I think pull better for them than for Republicans. That we could get to kind of an unpredictable place where, who knows what's going to happen when we get to that. But, if I had to kind of project it forward in my head, my guess is that the government shuts down for a while and they end up kind of compromising somewhere in the middle with, the ACA subsidies being restored for some limited period of time, which again, I think politically that would probably be, I think Republicans would be okay with that because again, it's a part of their agenda that's really unpopular, a vote that they took that was tough, that now they would be shielded from the consequences of that politically, which I don't think is a great thing. It's kind of like a campaign contribution to the Republicans basically in that respect. But once we get to that point of a shutdown, again, like it's hard to kind of totally know where things go from there. So we'll see. What about you? Do you think do you foresee that could be on the table?
Boy, I really don't know. Because in Trump 1.0, there were a number of occasions where he would demand that the filibuster be eliminated, and Mitch McConnell understood exactly what you were saying, Aaron, that the filibuster, its existence benefits Republicans and harms Democrats, and McConnell knew that that would be a bad idea. And I wonder though if attitudes have changed, especially if depending on how much they really think that they never will lose power. I tend to think that Senate Republican leaders, especially someone like John Thune, probably still understand, yeah, this may not be forever for them. But and I guess also it depends on how the conversation and the polling unfolds, because if the polls start to turn against Democrats, and the Republicans succeed in blaming Democrats for the shutdown, then Republicans have no reason to cave at all. But maybe they start to get desperate. I mean, also, who you never know. During Trump's first term, when he would make these wild demands, they were often just ignored, like crazy old grandpas yelling again. And now they usually get listened to. I think if Trump had gone around demanding states engage in mid-decade redistricting to gerrymander their congressional maps in 2017. I don't know that anyone would have listened to him. And now, they're for the most part, jumping at his request.
Mhm.
So if Trump in the middle of this says, "What are you doing? Just get rid of the filibuster, so we can, pass, the next big beautiful bullshit." Maybe they would. It's just such a weird point that we're at, that kind of our old frameworks for analyzing and assessing things, I think we have to constantly be reevaluating them.
Yeah, I think that's all right. One of the things that's heartening me a little bit more this time around than in March and April, I think it was March when we had this conversation, of course, like the Schumer cave, which I think
Yeah.
was a major sort of point of demoralization for Democrats, kind of the sense that Democrats win that fight without really having a plan, without really
Yep.
having a message, and then just kind of the first opportunity cave. Is that, I do see that it seems like on the Senate side, the talking points are very consistent across different members, including even more moderate ones, that they're making these maximalist demands in the healthcare space. So it does seem like there is the message. It does seem like there's a plan. It does seem like they're better prepared this time around. And then on the Republican side, I mean, if Trump demanded that they nuke the filibuster for this, maybe that gets them out of this jam. But I don't really know what other benefits there would be, because I believe, as soon as, I think even this winter, technically, I mean, they could do another reconciliation bill, right? Because you get one per fiscal year. I mean, there was talk even when they were doing the first one of possibly doing three before the midterms, which that won't happen, but they could do two. And, you can't do everything that you want to do necessarily in a reconciliation bill, because that's be limited to things that have budgetary impacts. But the point simply being that, if there's already talk of doing another reconciliation package, like what other measures would there be that getting rid of the filibuster would be beneficial for Trump? Maybe as we're talking about, you brought up the idea of like the elections next year, and like, there's this ongoing conversation on the left about like, people like Schumer, who seem very focused on the fact that Trump is declining in popularity, in the idea that, if they just kind of give him enough rope to hang himself, so to speak, that it's really going to damage Republicans going into the midterms. But then you have other people, Chris Murphy had put in this category, who are kind of sounding the alarm about whether the elections next year will be free and fair. Not even setting aside the gerrymandering, but like, could there be, some sort of like federal presence that tampers with the way that votes are counted or something like that? And I guess, if you get rid of the filibuster, doing kind of the Trump big lie voting legislation, they wouldn't call it that. They'd call it something on the opposite, where it's like the Election Integrity
Election
Act or something.
security, right? Yeah.
Yes. You could see, them doing something like that if there's no filibuster, because they would just need 50 votes in the Senate. So, maybe Trump, he's kind of wily in that way. I mean, maybe there is a little bit of chess happening if they get rid of the filibuster. But the point I was originally going to make is just that, if they're going to do another reconciliation package anyway, I don't really know what benefit beyond getting out of a short-term jam would be in it for Republicans by nuking the filibuster. But I guess as I was talking through it, like I said, I could see elections being one area heading into the midterms. Trump has talked about wanting to do an election bill, that would further kind of stack the deck for Republicans. He probably wouldn't have the votes as it stands right now, but if there's no filibuster, I guess maybe he would.
I want to get back to something that you pointed out earlier, which is that the March Schumer cave came about at least in considerable part because, as you were pointing out, Democrats had no plan. And the reason why they had no plan is because they did not expect House Republicans to be able to pass the budget bill at the time. That they, all Democrats in the House, or I think maybe Jared Golden didn't, but just about every Democrat in the House voted against the bill at that time. And then they were left just absolutely, shipped out to sea by the Senate, because then the thing passed, and then the Senate had to decide what to do, and then enough Senate Democrats gave the GOP the votes. At least this time, at least this time, they seem more prepared.
Mhm.
And I think, as we just saw with the House, passing the temporary spending bill today, Democrats know that they're not going to get bailed out by dysfunction under Mike Johnson. So, I don't want to say that fills me with hope, but at least they're not going, at least shouldn't get totally, blindsided by what happens next.
Yeah, and I did enjoy the fact that finally some of the DC reporters got savvy to some of the games that these House Republicans play, where Victoria Spartz tried her same trick this week, where she was like, "Oh, I don't know if I'm going to vote for the CR or not." And I saw like one tweet about it instead of like multiple Politico pieces, and then of course she voted for it today. The Burchetts and the Spartzes, where they do kind of the dance of, "I don't know if I can vote for more spending," and kind of gets them on TV, and they get their names in the headlines, and then they end up voting for whatever the leadership's priority is. So at least we were not really subjected to that particular news cycle, and they just approved it, and kind of everybody got on with their lives. And now we'll see next week. The drama will be with the Senate, which I believe they're taking a break next week for Rosh Hashanah, and then it's like pretty much right up against the deadline. Like, we're kind of running out of days. So
Yeah.
it seems pretty inevitable that we're going to at least have a short shutdown at this point.
Yeah, the deadline is September 30th.
Yeah.
I thought I saw, Aaron, that Victoria Spartz, she's the absolutely unhinged congresswoman from Indiana. I thought I saw that she did vote
Oh,
against.
did she vote no? Oh man, I'd have to retract my
I,
previous
I
comments.
thought I saw maybe it was Massey and Spartz. I don't know, but you're
Okay.
right. That dance has gotten super super stale, and we saw that. My God, to such an extreme with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Yeah.
All of these Republicans wound up falling in line.
I mean, it's
Um,
it's kind of ingenious because it gets them on TV, and it gets them on CNN. Not just Fox. They're kind of
yeah,
like the Maverick voice, and then they. But I will, if Sparks vote against it, it's one of these things which we saw this, and I'm a little unprepared to talk about this. I know we're running out of time, but there was a vote that came up on Trump's tariffs this week, where some of the Republicans who had taken votes, trying to strip Trump of the power to levy
right,
tariffs, flipped this week. When all of a sudden they were in a position because of other changes in the House where their votes would have actually been more meaningful, when it wasn't just performative, and the
right.
chips were actually down, then they voted, with the MAGA program. So there's always kind of that gamesmanship. Obviously, Mike Johnson is aware that I think they can lose like 3 votes in the House. And so you give members kind of a hall pass, okay, take a no vote on this one, then you can obviously go and campaign on that I voted against the wasteful spending in DC or whatever. Usually members don't follow through on that. If their votes are needed, maybe in this case, Farts was one of the members who got the lucky hall pass where she could vote no.
Well, we obviously are going to have a ton more to say about this next week. Um, someone,
Sparks voted against it. Golden voted
okay,
for it.
voted for it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So, score 1 for me on that, Aaron. Um, But yeah, we're going to have this is obviously I want to say this is going to be the number one story, but the
No.
Charlie Kirk, Jimmy Kimmel, all that. I mean, like you never know. But no matter what, it's going to be a big story. The looming shutdown, and we'll have plenty more to say about that next week. Thank you all for joining us. We had almost 900 folks tune in. Really appreciate you checking in with us on Friday afternoon. We will be back next Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. As always, if you are a subscriber of the Down Ballot, but have not yet subscribed to Public Notice, Aaron's publication, you absolutely must do so. It's at publicnotice.co, or you can find it on the Substack app, and vice versa. If you're a Public Notice subscriber, please find us at the-downballot.com. Again, also on the Substack app. Everyone, have a great weekend.
See you next Friday.